Hello everybody, I am Becky and I can be found as Becky Burns Gibson on Pinterest, Instagram, and Ravelry. Welcome to this podcast. This is the third part of a sew-along for the McCalls 6696 shirt dress. And today we will be assembling the bodice. So we are going to begin by stitching the darts in the bodice, and we're going to prepare our darts by matching up the legs that we cut into at the bottom of the dart and pinning all the way up to the circle. And we have lines drawn in between the legs and the circle with a water-soluble marker, and this way we have a line on which to sew. Okay, so we are going to back stitch at the beginning of the dart to secure the stitch, and we're going to sew all the way up to through the dot, and we're going to sew off of the dot. A lot of people will take the ends of the thread and they will tie them off to secure this end, but I don't do that. I just sew off, and I never have any problems with it coming apart. But don't try to back stitch at the dot, because if you do, you'll have pointy darts. That's how I secure this end. I just sew off. Back stitch at the beginning. Follow your line that you've marked with your water-soluble marker. And either stitch off or you can tie off the ends. So I'm going to sew the other piece, and then I'm going to go to the ironing board, and I'm going to iron the side seam dart down, and then I'm going to iron the front dart toward the center. Okay, next we're going to take piece number 4, the back, and we're going to gather the upper and the lower edges between the circles that we have marked. And we are going to gather them by stitching 2 lines of really loose stitches, and we're going to stitch them within the seam allowance, so that they won't be seen when the garment is sewn together. So I'm going to do 1 line of stitching at 3/8 of an inch and 1 line of stitching at 1/4 of an inch, and that will be within the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So first I'm going to set my stitch length to 4. And I'm going to need to get myself some tails. So now I have some tails, and I'm going to need these tails because we're going to pull these tails to form the gathers. Okay, first line of stitching at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And we're not going to cut our threads using the machine. We're going to raise our foot and pull out the thread so that we can make ourselves some tails. You can see it's already sort of gathering. Okay, next line of stitching I'm going to do at 3/8 of an inch. Now I'm going to do the same thing along the bottom, but I wanted to show you when you gather your stitches, you don't use the top threads because they'll be too hard. Use your bobbin threads. For some reason, they're easier to pull for gathering. So I'm going to do the same thing along the bottom. Okay, what we're going to do next is we're going to pin piece number 5, the yoke back, to the upper edge of piece number 4, the bodice back. So the first thing we're going to do is match up the marks that we made for center back. Pin that. Then we're going to use our bobbin threads, our thread tails, to gather these stitches so that the circles match up, and then we'll pin those, and we'll pin all the way across the back, and then we're going to go to the sewing machine and baste it down. Okay, I have attached the back yoke, piece number 5 to piece number 4 to the upper edge. I have lined up the center back, and I have lined up the circles on both pieces. I have adjusted my gathers so that they're nice and even. And I've pinned all the way across the back. And I'm going to do a basting stitch, so I have set my stitch length to 4. And I'm going to sew at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, we are going to pin the right side of the yoke to the wrong side of the bodice back. So we're going to match up the center back, match up these circles, pin across the back, and we are going to set our stitch length back to 2.5, which is our normal default stitch length. And we are going to sew at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance through all 3 layers. And we're going to back stitch at the beginning and end. I'm having technical difficulties. Okay, so I had my thread on my machine break. I have rethreaded the machine. I'm ready to sew. 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm going to go to my iron and I'm going to iron the seam, the yolks up. It's pretty. Okay, now take what you just sewn together and lie it right side up. And take your bodice fronts and lie them right side down so that the right sides are together. And then pin your upper edges together at the shoulders, but only pin it to one piece. Let the other piece stay loose. So I have pinned my shoulder pieces together. I have matched up my notches here. And I have let the facing piece stay loose. And I'm going to sew the shoulders together, leaving the facing piece loose at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So here's what we have. And the next thing we're going to do is take the facing piece. We're going to iron it down by 5/8 of an inch. And then we're going to slip stitch it like that. Okay, so I have ironed the seam toward the back. I have ironed the facing down at 5/8 of an inch. And I'm going to line up the facing so that it's just past the stitching. And I'm going to pin it down just like I have done here on this side. And I'm going to slip stitch all the way across. Okay, so we're ready to slip stitch by hand. And don't skip this step. I know when I first started assembling garments, and when the pattern instructions said to slip stitch, I would just go across it with my sewing machine. And you know, a lot of people do that because they just don't like to do hand stitching. But I have learned that it really does make a difference in the appearance of the garment if you will slip stitch when the pattern says to slip stitch. It just gives a more professional and clean look. So I don't have a GoPro. This is the best I can do as far as showing you how to slip stitch. So you're going to go into your fabric just a tiny bit, and then you go into your folded fabric, go into your fold and go across maybe 1/4 of an inch. And then go in to the back fabric just a tiny amount so that you can't see it from the other side. And then go into your folded fabric, go into the fold, and staying in the fold, going across about 1/4 of an inch. And then a little bit into your back fabric. Okay, so we're going to do that all the way across. Okay, my yoke is all assembled. That's what it looks like on the inside. The outside looks nice and neat. So the pattern does not say to top stitch the yoke, but I enjoy the look of a top stitch yoke. So I will be top stitching across the shoulders and across the bottom of the yoke. And I don't have a top stitching foot. So I'm going to use a blind stitch foot because it has this piece here that you can line up your fabric with. There is a center piece here. You have to be really careful to set your needle position so that it clears that. So I'm going to line my seam up with the little piece here on the blind stitch foot. And I'm going to set my needle position over. I'm going to make sure it clears, and it does. So I don't know if you can see this or not, but there's just a nice, straight, even line. A blind stitch foot really does a great job. So the next thing that we're going to do, we're going to pin the seams together at the underarm, matching up our notches. Well, that's not going to work for me. If I match up my notches here, that's really going to put the edges off. That's probably because I graded out and did some manipulation there. So I'm going to just line up my edges, sew these together. Then I'm going to take this to the serger and finish off this seam together. And I'm going to set my needle on my machine back to its regular position. And change my presser foot back to a regular general purpose presser foot. .5/8 inch seam allowance. Back stitch at the front. Back stitch at the end. Now we're going to take this to the serger. We're going to finish off these seams together at the serger. If you don't have a serger, you can zigzag, use a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine on each piece before you sew the seam together. Or you can use an overcasting stitch on your sewing machine if your sewing machine has one. It just won't cut the edges off, but that's not a big deal. Or you can also French seam or Hong Kong finish. Those are a little bit in detail, and if you're gonna French seam or Hong Kong finish, you will need to reference another video to learn how to do that. But they make a beautiful finish. But I'm going to be serging mine. Well, thank you for joining me for the McCalls 6696 Part 3, which was assembling the bodice. Join me on the next video, which will be attaching the band and attaching the sleeves. If you like what you've seen, please click the like button. And if you want to see more, subscribe. Until next time, bye-bye.